Wasn't Elgar on one of your Desert Island discs?
Yes, it was. Nimrod I chose from Elgar, yeah. That's true.
When I listened to that, I noticed that you got quite emotional when you were talking about your upbringing, your parents.
Yeah, it was one particular point about my brother not having seen my father, because my brother was born in April of '39, and the war broke out in August of '39, or September, I think it was, end of August, beginning of September. And my father had already joined the army because he saw the war coming, and he got sent away immediately. And before the war had even started, he did his basic training at Aldershot and then was posted out to North Africa. So my brother never really saw my father. My father didn't see my brother until he finally got leave in 1943, by which time he was 4. So my brother hadn't seen.
That's amazing that stirred you so much. I felt that maybe the emotion was coming from somewhere else, about maybe something you remembered.
No, I know I did the opposite in a way. I was very lucky to be born 10 years after my brother, because my brother was born right into the Second World War. They lived in Paisley, just outside Glasgow, which was regularly bombed like London. Once the Nazis took over Norway, their bombers from Norway were able to reach central Scotland. The Clyde was the biggest shipbuilding place in the world. Heavy engineering was a Nazi target. So he would spend times in the bunkers with my mother as a little boy. So my mother had to work in the mills. She was a mill girl, while my father was off fighting. So they had it much tougher. I had it much easier as a kid. I never lost my father. My father was there all the time. My mother didn't work by that time. She was there, and we were brought up it was in a council estate, but it was a nice part of town with a big garden, 5-minute walk. You were way up in the hills in the countryside because it was on the edge of town. So my generation was the lucky generation, and I think my brother's generation was the in-between generation. They had been through tough times, but then they prospered in the post-war prosperity that came. But when I look at, my parents were born. My father was born in 1911, and my mother in 1912. So you look at what their lives spanned. They were born into the First World War. Yeah. No sooner had they come out of that than they were thrown into the Great Depression and mass unemployment and huge social unrest. And then just as they looked like they're coming out of that, they're thrown into the Second World War. And so I always said that my parents took, and then having survived that, and of course many didn't, they then, terrible time after the war as well, when the country was still on rationing. And so I was born in '49, but I still had a ration card. Still got it somewhere. Yeah, I never used it, but even if you were born in '49, you were still given a food ration card, 4 years after the war had ended. Wow. And so they then enjoyed, they participated in the post-war prosperity that began in the 50s. And because of everything they'd been through, they were very grateful for anything they could get. They did not have high ambitions or high expectations, just the fact that things had got better, they could afford decent clothes, maybe even go on holiday abroad, as we eventually did in '61. And they took huge satisfaction through me and my brother having the opportunities that they never had. You know, Tom Brokaw in the United States, the great NBC anchorman, has looked at this generation in American terms too, which went through all the same things. If anything, the Great Depression was worse in America than it was here. And he wrote this book called The Greatest Generation. And that's probably what they are. If you look at what they went through and how they survived and how they solved the great evil of Nazi Germany. They were, and if I had more time, I would do a British equivalent of that book as a tribute to my parents' generation, as the greatest generation.
So you're particularly close to your parents, weren't
you? Yeah, not hugely close. I mean, I always remember at school, school kids, friends, their parents were like their best friends. They told them everything, and so I never did that. We were kind of reserved, but they were good parents.
How did they pass away?
My father died of bowel cancer in the end, and my mother really died of lung cancer. They'd both been big smokers, though not in their latter years, but I think by then the damage was done. But you know, my father was 76, 77, he had quite a tough life. My mother was almost 80. You know, when you come to 80, you're going to die of something.
Were you quite close to them in those final days?
Yes, very much so.
And what's
You only get closer. You know, when you get closest to them, you get closest to them after they die.
Can you explain or elaborate on that a bit?
You think a lot more about them. Sometimes when they're alive, you take them for granted. There's never a day goes by that I don't have a conversation with my parents, just to my mind.
Really? That sort of surprised me. You always look like someone who's thrusting forward, not necessarily looking back. Or
but you know, I'm very grateful to them. They came from very modest means. They gave me a fantastic. I mean, I had a hugely privileged background, hugely privileged, because I had two decent parents that cared about me and cared about my education. So compared to a lot of kids today, kids who come from much richer backgrounds than I ever did, they're not as privileged as I am. You know.
When you say you have conversations with your parents, in what sense do you?
But I just think sometimes no, it's not a religious thing. It's just that no, it's not that. It's just sometimes I think, well, what would Dad have thought about that, or what would Mum think about that, or I was very taken by. One of the reasons why I wanted to go out to the first Gulf War was not only because I was sending journalists there and putting them in the line of fire, but my father had been a desert rat, and the desert rats had been sent out to fight that war on behalf of the British, the first to get Saddam out of Kuwait. And he'd been a desert rat with Montgomery, and he'd been at Alamein and so on. And when I was out there, I always had my father in mind, and I met a lot of the desert rats while I was there. I remember getting into there was this Scottish sergeant, I think he was a sergeant or a sergeant major, and we were in this Hafer Albertine. It was only 24 hours before the land war was going to begin, and he came up to me in his broad Glaswegian accent. He was in uniform, he had his gun, and he said, "I saw you. I've seen you on television." He said, "You're the one you called the Republican Guard the elite." And I said, "Yeah, I think I probably have called them the elite." I said, "I think probably everybody calls them the elite, but I'm pretty sure I call them the elite." And he literally said, "Yeah, but if they're the elite, what the fuck are we?" He was the desert rat, and I said, "You know something, I take your point." I said, "Because my father was a desert rat in 1941. And he said, "Your father?" I said, "My father entered a private and came out the war a major." And he said, "Anyway, that's all right then." And he marched off.
What do you think your parents would make of you today? And what?
A lot of what I've done, my parents don't understand, and they didn't quite know what I was doing, and I moved into a different world, in a different life that they could barely understand. But they always took great pride in the achievements that I had, and they were always proud. I mean, they were proud of my brother as well, who was a big success. Mainly they did. I think the one thing they probably regretted is I never got married. They never saw me getting married anyway. I guess I still could. But I think my mother regretted that, but she knew not to make that an issue.